declare open this public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs, inquiry into economic self-determination and opportunities for First Nations Australians. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands of which we meet today and pay my respects to their ancestors, past and present. That includes our international guests joining us here today. And I extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and Indigenous peoples and their cultural and spiritual connections to the lands in which we are meeting on. And on behalf of the committee, I welcome in particular any traditional owners who are here today. I remind all senators and members that proceedings are to be conducted in a respectful and courteous way. And I remind senators this is a workplace, and it is especially true for the public officials and stakeholders who are present before us. It is essential that they are treated with respect and that they feel safe when they present to our hearings before us. As Chair, I'll be particularly vigilant in ensuring the cultural safety for First Nations people and culturally and racially marginalised groups during these hearings. In accordance with the Committee's resolution of the 7th of September 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the inquiry's website. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report proceedings of the committee. I now welcome our guests from the High Commission of Canada and Indigenous Services Canada, and I want to extend a special thank you for making time to give evidence at our proceedings today, and again acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on your country too. I now invite you to tell us your name and the capacity in which you appear here before us today. Not sure where I should start here.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Why don't I start? So my name's Julie Sunday, and I'm Canada's High Commissioner to Australia. I'll let you the others introduce, and I have a short statement to launch the meeting.
Thank you. Mr. Keller or Mr. Conn?
Hi, sorry, I got mute problems.
And now we've lost your camera for a second, but you're back now. You're good.
I'm good. Okay, great. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Keith Conn. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Lands and Economic Development with Indigenous Services Canada, and I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin peoples here in Ottawa. And it's a lovely evening, and it's dark. So it's lovely. But pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I have a short statement as well after the High Commissioner speaks.
Thank you. You're on mute, Mr. Culler. There should be a little unmute button down the bottom of your screen, hopefully.
There we go. Thank you. I saw that unmute. Well, good day, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Harold Calla. My ancestral name is Skulk. I'm a member of the Squamish First Nation in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I'm the Executive Chair of the First Nation Financial Management Board. And I will also have a statement after. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I've got a short spiel before we get to your opening statements. So although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. And because we're online, I don't need you to say your name every time, although actually it might be useful for Ms. Price, who is joining us via teleconference. So if you don't mind actually saying your name each time before you speak for for the ease of her participation online. And before I invite you to make a brief opening statement, I'll let you know we have Senator Ghosh here, who is a senator from Western Australia, and Ms. Melissa Price, who is a House of Representatives member in Western Australia. I now go to you, High Commissioner.
Thank you. So I very much appreciate the opportunity to join you today. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the land on which I am joining you from, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I wish to acknowledge and pay respects to their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of the city and region, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us at the hearing today. So since my arrival 2 weeks ago, I've really been struck by the similarities between our two large countries with geographically dispersed and diverse populations and comparable economies and systems of government. I recognize that Canada and Australia also have a similar dark colonial history with Indigenous peoples, marked by dispossession of lands, denial of rights, forced assimilation, and systemic racism. Canada and Australia share, however, in a commitment to advance reconciliation and build a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples. Importantly, this includes overcoming barriers to economic development that will help achieve economic reconciliation and better socioeconomic outcomes for Indigenous peoples and their communities. I'm really pleased to be joined today by my colleagues in Canada. I can't confirm you're both in Ottawa. I don't think you're both in Ottawa. So it was Keith's team who led on the Government of Canada's submission into this inquiry today. We thought it was important to contribute as there's much that Canada and Australia can learn from one another in this space. So I hope that we'll be able to continue to find opportunities beyond the inquiry to discuss this important issue, including finding new and innovative ways to bring our Indigenous peoples together to exchange and collaborate on economic self-determination. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. We're going to Mr. Khan next, or Mr. Keller, I'm not sure which.
Mr. Khan.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be here with you. I've already introduced myself, but also just for purposes of background, I should also add that I'm from the Indigenous community of the Moose Cree, located on the southern shores of James Bay in northern Ontario, where I was born and raised, and then pursued my education by going south. My team on the Economic Policy Development Branch drafted Canada's submission to this inquiry, and Indigenous Services Canada works collaboratively with Indigenous partners and other government departments, including Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs, to improve access to high-quality services for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. The department's vision is to support and empower Indigenous peoples to independently deliver services and address the socioeconomic conditions in their communities. In support of the department's mandate, I oversee lands and economic development sector, which promotes Indigenous economic development and works with First Nations communities, Indigenous partners and organizations, and other government departments on the administration, management, and environmental protection of reserved lands. Further, the sector also provides direct and indirect services to First Nations and Inuit Métis communities, partnerships, and entrepreneurs through core and targeted funding partnerships. The goal of these programs and services is to support First Nations as they develop capacity and reclaim jurisdiction in the management of reserved lands, resources, and the environment, and if they choose to do so, pursue sectoral self-governance, laying the foundation for sustainable economic development, and to support the full economic participation of Indigenous communities and entrepreneurs to close the socioeconomic gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. Further, the lands and economic development sector is also home to the Indigenous Climate Policy Hub, and has developed a 5-year working strategy on climate change to support Indigenous peoples to build climate resiliency and advance self-determined climate actions. And Canada and Australia have similar, as we mentioned earlier, High Commissioner, Canada and Australia have similar colonial histories. In our case, we know that the government played a critical role in creating the conditions of the socioeconomic disparities that exist today by undermining Indigenous economies, constraining economic activity, and asserting control. First Nations continue to face barriers that obstruct Indigenous peoples from pursuing their visions for their economic futures. Economic reconciliation, as I see it, demands change, specifically a change in who sets and drives the economic agenda. In spring of 2023, Canada announced the process to co-develop our economic reconciliation framework with Indigenous partners. Our sector, my sector, is responsible for leading this process with our partners, and a number of Indigenous organizations were asked to lead the engagement process to identify distinctions-based visions for economic prosperity and well-being. These are our 3 constitutionally recognized groups of Indigenous peoples. Over the last year, we have seen attention paid to a few key economic priorities, which I believe are relevant to the discussions for Australia is also having through this public inquiry. These include ensuring First Nations are adequately resourced with capacity at both the community and institutional levels to make strategic economic decisions and pursue their economic priorities. 2, increasing access to financial services and affordable capital, which are critical to unlocking economic potential. 3, supporting Indigenous businesses as they grow and scale and creating opportunities for Indigenous entrepreneurs to thrive in both domestic and international markets. And addressing barriers for economic self-determination that limit governments from being able to generate revenue or make decisions at the pace of business. And lastly, increasing Indigenous control and jurisdiction over lands and resources, ensuring that Indigenous peoples can steward their lands and assets in a way that reflect their values and aspirations. I'm almost near my conclusion. Addressing these themes will require bold actions, to say the least, including removing long-standing structural and systemic barriers. But I am confident, optimistic, that by supporting Indigenous-led policy and program development, we can effectively drive transformative change. To build economic prosperity, we must support Indigenous-led initiatives, engage Indigenous leadership, actively work to remove barriers and create opportunities for Indigenous peoples to pursue their economic visions for the future. In my current role, I look forward to continuing to work with partners to overcome these barriers and make economic development opportunities more accessible for our Indigenous partners. And again, I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity to share a bit of our knowledge and experiences with the committee, and I'm happy to answer any further questions. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Con. Mr. Culler. Am I saying that right? Am I getting your name right, Mr. Culler? Culler.
You are. You are.
Right.
It's often pronounced Kaya because in Spanish the 2 L's are I, but I am a Kala. And my father, who was not status, was Italian. So that's my background, including some Hawaiian, I might add. I want to thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you. I was there probably 5 or 6 years ago with the Public Policy Initiative as a part of the Canadian delegation, where I started to speak about economic development and some of the evolutions that were occurring in Canada in the creation of institutions to be able to support economic development. I think it's really important to start with admitting our histories. If you're not prepared to do that, then I think the public is unaware of the challenges that need to be overcome and the realities of the past. I'm often approached by others and saying, well, what do you guys want now? Well, what we want is to see the legislative framework that took us out of the mainstream economy repealed. We want to have access to the ability to participate in the mainstream economy. We want our jurisdictions recognized. We want to be self-governing. And we want to use those tools to promote economic development. In Canada, as in your community, the Indigenous population is very fastly growing. At the moment, the cost of the poverty that both of our countries bear is only going to grow with it. And if we don't foster the concept of re-engaging in economic development, recreating our entrepreneurial class, and getting access to the tools that others have to be able to participate in the economy, it's only going to exacerbate the differences of opinion between our populations. I think Canada has, in many cases, led the way with the recognition of a need to develop tools to be able to support First Nation communities who have been denied access to the economy. The rest of the world around us evolved over a couple of hundred years. We were locked, landlocked, and structurally locked for years, became wards to Canada, and were not allowed to evolve in a way that others were. Now, it's imperative that Canada support the evolution that has to occur in our communities to be able to support economic development in a way that responds to the economic development needs of Canada itself. This is now no longer just an issue of providing economic development opportunity to Indigenous people within Canada. The Canadian economy needs Indigenous people to participate in the decisions that Canada is about to make around its natural resources and other activities that it's pursuing right now. So there's an imperative now. It's not seen as a special consideration being given to a group of people within, although we think we have them, but it is an imperative now. It doesn't matter whether you're right or left of the political spectrum. This is now a reality that's facing all politicians. We have to be able to pursue these kinds of initiatives, particularly in a deglobalizing world where natural resources are key to the evolution of economies around the world. We need to be in a position where the impediments to attract investment and get the final investment decision on initiatives are expedited. This requires consent from First Nations, and it requires government itself to modify its processes to be able to get to a decision around investments in a much more timely way than they are today. I'm also on the board of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion that took place between Alberta and British Columbia. We brought oil to tidal water for the first time in British Columbia. That took 20 years to get done for approvals to take place. The cost went from $7 billion estimated to 30 billion over this period of time. Inflation, indecision, makes it very difficult for the international community to consider investing in countries that don't have expedited processes to be able to support this kind of decision. This requires sharing power with First Nation communities over environmental decisions that are made, permitting, and a requirement that there be some consideration given to economic participation by First Nations. I accompanied the Natural Resources Minister last fall to London, Paris, and New York to speak to the investment community about investing in Canada. And the first statements that came out of the minister were, in Canada, we have a constitution, we have Indigenous rights embedded in that constitution, and we expect everybody to respond to those rights. And Canada will support economic inclusion. And it did so in the next budget with a $5 billion loan guarantee program to start that process, to make it known that Canada was prepared to stand behind that. Now, it's not terribly significant amount, and I never thought I'd say that as an accountant, that $5 billion wasn't significant, but in comparison to the kinds of investments that are required, it's not. But it is a beginning. And I think the thing that the Fiscal Management Act did was create the process to build capacity in First Nation communities in a way that was consistent with the way the rest of the world looks at accountability and transparency. Financial Management Board developed standards for certification around accountability and transparency, and has now, and it's an optional piece of legislation, we now have close to 60% of all First Nation communities in Canada who have voluntarily submitted their desire to Canada to become part of the legislation. And that avails them to the kinds of services that the three institutions, and now a fourth, provide. The First Nations Finance Authority raises capital on behalf of First Nation based upon those who are eligible to enter the borrowing pool by being certified by the Financial Management Board, who have now raised over $2.6 billion on behalf of First Nations at rates comparable to other orders of government and terms that other orders of government are able to provide. The First Nation Tax Commission, which now is supporting First Nation in the administration of fiscal powers. Every government has an ability to raise its revenue. Every government has a geographic boundary that they function within. Canada is recognizing the need to share some of that authority and revenue streams with First Nations to be able to support self-government. But I think more importantly, what's happening in Canada is the non-Indigenous community that's seeing the benefits arise from our participation in the mainstream economy by seeing resource developments occur, by seeing, in the case of my own community in downtown Vancouver, a $4 billion housing project that's going to provide rental housing into the Vancouver market. There is no limitation to the type of activity that First Nations are capable of engaging in. I think it's really important to appreciate that we have some rights that we are using to participate in the economies that we have rights over. Most people around the world are aware that in Atlantic Canada, where there are fishing rights, the First Nations in Atlantic Canada bought a $1 billion seafood company to be in a position where they could bring stability to that industry and create a revenue stream for themselves in the future. They've just recently bought a shipyard. So what we're seeing, and exponentially now, is that as First Nations are able to generate some wealth, they're reinvesting that wealth, and the regional economies are receiving a significant benefit from this. But this is happening, this is not being put upon us as colonial systems traditionally have done. This is being developed by people who are Indigenous, who have had the opportunity to work in both worlds and are coming home and providing support into their communities to be able to begin to engage with the private sector in a way that we couldn't before. But we're doing so in ways in which there's a cultural fit, where we are mindful of Mother Earth and the things that we have to do to protect it, but we're interested we have a saying, nothing about us without us. And I think that applies to a lot of the economic activity that occurs in this country. We need to invest in education. We need to get to our youth. We talk a lot in Canada about inclusion. The fastest way for the Indigenous community to gain momentum and to approach being comparable to the non-Indigenous community is through inclusion, particularly the private sector, including us in their work, in their boards, in their senior management teams, providing initiatives that allow First Nations to not lose their culture and identity, but to participate. And our hope is that it's like a secondment into these environments, and then they come back into their communities. What business needs and the economy needs is people in the Indigenous community sitting across the table that can speak the same language, that has the same experience and the same knowledge. And we think that requires institutional development. Access to capital is going to be key in all of this. And I know when I was in Australia, speaking to the capital markets in Australia, ESG, ESGI, the Indigenous that we call it, is now really prevalent in the investment decisions that are making. In Canada, the government of Canada supported the Financial Management Board in participation with the International Sustainability Standards Board around what standards should look like for ESG and how Indigenous rights should be recognized. So what we're finding now is these Indigenous institutions are having a place in the international community and are being recognized by the international community, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing. So we think that the future is bright as long as we continue to move at the pace of business. And as long as bureaucracy is prepared to support some of the legislative pieces that have been made recently to devolve, to work themselves out of business, in effect, into First Nation communities and into the service delivery that is required to deal with the circumstances that we find ourselves in, which were not of our doing. So I think it's, we have a very common history. I learned when I went down there several years ago. There are some differences, I realize, but to me, both countries have a choice. Do you want to continue to bear in your gross domestic expenditures the cost of the poverty in Indigenous communities? Or do you want to enable Indigenous communities to participate in the growth of your GDP? That's really the question that you have to ask yourself. And you have to start looking at these programs not as providing services, but investments. And you need to develop key performance indicators that measure the success of these initiatives in a way that can demonstrate improved well-being within the Indigenous community, improved contributions to the gross domestic product. And I think that if we do those kinds of things, you'll get meaningful input. I think our non-Indigenous populations need to really understand our history, and they need to understand how they are going to benefit from Indigenous economic participation and growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Callow. And I should also say that I'm a Muddy Wamba Wamba woman from northwest Victoria and over the border into New South Wales as well. We will now proceed to questions, and I will first go to Senator Ghosh.
Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to you all. Can I say thank you very much for being here. The High Commissioner's touched on the shared history and aspects, as have you all, and I think from the evidence we've heard before this inquiry, it's certainly the case that we in Australia regard many of the initiatives that have been undertaken in Canada in the First Nations spaces as being at the forefront, as you say, or really kind of quite revolutionary in a global sense. So it is with great appreciation and a sense of gratitude that we approach you appearing before us here today. One of the issues that recurs before this inquiry is the way in which First Nations people in Australia can leverage native title rights or land rights to build economic independence and sustainability. May I ask, how has the first National Land Management Delegated Authority process enabled Indigenous Canadians to utilise their property rights under Canadian law and in the Canadian economy?
I see Keith turned his camera off. I think, first of all, there's been a litany of Supreme Court of Canada decisions that have affirmed the rights of Indigenous entitlement to land and resources in traditional territories. It's hard to walk back from those things. The other thing that's been hard to walk back on that you're getting a lot of now is treaty entitlements. The failure of the government of Canada to support the decisions that they did make in the treaties. So you're getting some land returned. The other thing that's happening now is, I think one of the mistaken notions, even within Canada, is that First Nations have a veto. the Supreme Court of Canada has conferred a veto on First Nations. That, in my opinion, is not true. What the Supreme Court of Canada has said is where there's infringement and where there's a decision to infringe, there are consequences. And that has caused a pause in the part of the private sector and others to try to understand what the implications of that are, and that it's far better for First Nations to be involved in the use of their lands and traditional territories than not. So I think that's part of it. The other thing that happened in my community is we bought a tree farm license from a private sector company, 238,000 hectares. But we bought it. We bought them out, and we now have a form of land tenure that's very akin to, the next step is fee simple. But nothing happens in that tree farm license in our traditional territory now without our knowledge. So those are some of the ways that we've done that, is to take those rights that the Supreme Court of Canada has inferred exist, and that there is a requirement for consultation and accommodation. And we've utilized those tools to be able to support our inclusion and the development of regional economies. I hope that answers partly.
No, it does. Mr. Conn, did you want to add anything, or?
No, but Harold did an excellent job in responding. He is the expert. I've been thinking of myself on camera, but I can't. I was bumped off, got back on. Now I'm looking at my beautiful self. I can see everybody else on the screen, but I don't know what the heck's going on there, but I'll try to figure that out.
If I could jump in just very quickly on that, I think what Mr. Kalla is referencing is quite interesting, and the committee may want to look at some of the Supreme Court references around what is referred to as the duty to consult, so consultation and accommodation, and how that has then been interpreted in a policy sense by the government. But I think that could be a further interesting discussion. But the legal framework in Canada has some unique features based on some of the rulings. Thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
If I can conclude with one comment. We got our Constitution in '82. We fought in the courts for 30 years between government and Indigenous people about what it meant. I would strongly suggest that Australia not put itself in that position. Had Canada in 1982 accepted the outcomes and took the leadership to include Indigenous people in 1982, Canada would be much farther ahead today. I appeal to you to not make that same mistake. Get them involved or acknowledge they exist instead of trying to fight it, because that caused Canada significant economic impacts. In British Columbia, the province of British Columbia, where I live, we lost a $40 billion LNG opportunity to Australia, quite frankly, as a result of our inability to get our act together around those issues. So the sooner that you incorporate that into your thinking, the sooner you can develop processes to accommodate it.
I'd like to say that we've learned from that process, but we too have had a very complicated legal history around First Nations land rights, among other things. I'm interested to ask about the First Nations Fiscal Management Act and whether that's been a useful regulatory intervention in terms of supporting Indigenous people to grow and manage their own wealth and perhaps sustain that wealth over a period of time.
It's been the most successful piece of Indian legislation in the history of Canada. To be blunt, we've had a great partnership with the government of Canada around it. Indigenous Services Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations have really supported the development of the institutions and expanded our mandate to support their interests in working cooperatively with First Nations to move towards a fiscal financing relationship that's more representative of a self-governing First Nation, to use the tools of the FMA, Fiscal Management Act, and the Tax Commission to support the sharing of fiscal powers around property taxes, property transfer taxes. Natural Resource Canada is now producing a report that will talk about natural resource revenue sharing arrangements. So in the absence of these institutions, that wouldn't have happened. Our data that we collect has shown clearly that First Nations who become more accountable and transparent and engage in economic development, their well-being indexes improve significantly, and their own source revenue and employment increase significantly. So without it, I'm not going to say we wouldn't be making some progress, but what we provide through the Financial Management Board, as an example, is capacity development into First Nation communities. We develop some standards that are COSO compliant, international standards on accountability and transparency. And we bring things into being in a community like audit committees, concepts of independence and transparency, all of those kinds of concepts that we traditionally had, but we're now incorporating in a modern day context. These have been exceptionally valuable tools. And we're again on the cusp of, I think, some significant changes of being able to look at monetization of some of these federal transfers for capital to support the infrastructure required to promote economic development at the community level.
Yeah. So how does the Indigenous Service Canada's land and economic development programs support Indigenous economic participation in Canada? And if I might tack on a sort of blunter question, what has worked in that space and what hasn't?
Okay, good question. So we're supportive broadly in terms of economic participation through our Strategic Partners Initiative, which provides capacity dollars, planning dollars, and project dollars for Indigenous communities who partner with private sector, and including provincial governments at times on, for example, clean energy projects. We have clean energy projects across the nation, which has been well received, contributing to our net zero targets. We also have a strong and industrious and excellent model of entrepreneurial supports for Indigenous small and medium-sized businesses, including women and youth. So they're also participating in the local economy or the regional economy. So that's great success. It was announced in the federal budget, a renewal and increased funding of $345 million over 5 years. We could do more. It's often overprescribed, and we certainly want to make more investments on that. That's a good news story, absolutely. We're also indirectly working with the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, but they're self-sustaining, but we often look at their tools and toolbox to support communities in terms of planning, organizing, executing some major projects in the country that are complicated, complex negotiations, but it's been well received as an organization. I think they have 30 members and growing. They have an annual event that's open to the public, so you might want to think about that in next year. I think it's next April, Harold.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and you really want to come to that.
You want to come to that.
15 or 1,600 people, private sector. Included.
Private sector, bankers, Indigenous entrepreneurs, government officials, politicians, and yeah, it's a great, very synergistic event. And there's a lot of people who can capitalize on that and side events. It's really a significant movement, and we're very supportive of their work. Yeah, I'll just keep that in a nutshell.
Are you able to outline for us the purpose and interim outcomes of the additions to reserve process that I understand is underway?
Yes, I could probably do a follow-up on that. I could provide you the detail. It's quite complicated. We do have an existing ATR policy, addition to reserve policy, which is not efficient, takes too much time. It takes too many years to actually, settle these complicated additions to reserve. We have a partnership table with the Indigenous peoples, mostly First Nations, of course, and Crown Indigenous Relations and the Assembly First Nations and others to look at some major transformative policy changes to an ATR, perhaps a new policy frame. So that's in play as we speak. Certainly could provide you a lot more detail in terms of how this works, what the objectives are, and some of the successes, but also some of the challenges. So we'll do a follow-up. Is it what's it called? A follow-through? I don't know the correct term.
You provide additional information on notice.
On notice, yes. Wonderful. There we go. Learn something today. On notice.
And while I'm sorry, Mr. Con.
Go ahead.
Oh no, and while I don't purport to speak for my fellow committee members, I think certainly on all the topics that you indicated that additional information may be provided, I think it would be gratefully received by the committee on the topics that you've addressed today. So almost take that as given. Now,
yes,
I think the opening statements have identified and have discussed the various historical and other types of barriers that are faced by First Nations people, and unfortunately that's something that Australia and Canada share. Are you able to, in a macro sense for me, and I think this will be nearly my final question, if not my final question, outline whether holistically there's progress that you're seeing that makes you optimistic, or I appreciate the generality of the question, but whether these programs are working across First Nations populations in Canada.
Harold, do you want to take a stab initially?
You guys ask tough questions. I think that there is significant steps forward being made by Canada. There's always an issue politically about whether or not we're being given very unique rights and circumstances. Okay, and somehow that has to be overcome. I think, for a long time, the Indigenous movement focused on legal rights and title. Okay. And thank goodness they did, because some of it has been affirmed. But now it's being shifted to economic development. The Deputy Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Valerie Gideon, who is another Indigenous person, came from the Assembly of First Nation meeting this past summer and said to us, Harold, nobody was talking about rights. Everybody, all the chiefs and council were talking about its economic development. Now that's a mind shift, and one that I never thought I'd live to see the day of. But I think that's the kind of mind shift that has to take place, because people see success from other Indigenous communities around them. Too often, we try to think that all Indigenous communities can move lockstep in a way that everyone can see visibly. Well, that's not the reality. As I often say to parliamentary committees like this one, don't expect us to do what you yourselves can't do. The rest of the country doesn't move lockstep, so we can't either. And like it or not, you have to find what we refer to as a coalition of the willing, who are prepared to move beyond the status quo, not abandon any of their Aboriginal rights or title, but to advance those things that improve the lives in their communities. The suicide rates, the abuse rates, the drugs and alcohol are very challenging in our Indigenous communities. I'm now hearing this morning from Chief Commissioner Manny Jules that now organized crime is moving into some of the northern communities. So if they don't have a hope, okay, if they can't feed their families, if they're living in abject poverty, they're going to reach out to anything that will help improve their lives. And our challenge today is that we have to respond to that, but we have to do so in an accelerated way. Everything we do is not going to be successful. there's something that I learned a long time ago that was described to me as a noble failure. If you learn from it and it's not catastrophic, if we wait for perfection, we'll wait a long time. And I think that that attitude, while sometimes hard to explain or justify in a parliament, I think as I say, you do need key performance indicators to begin to understand. And what we're able to demonstrate through the Fiscal Management Act are those key economic performance indicators. I mean, Keith spoke about the Major Projects Coalition. That actually was founded in the Financial Management Board because First Nations couldn't get access to capital to buy their equity position in major projects. Well, we had a line of sight to a problem. We developed an institutional framework to be able to support it. And when it matured, we booted it out the door and said, you got to go and be yourself now. Those are the kinds of decisions that I think government has to make if we want to achieve the kind of success that I think you're looking for.
Thank you, Senator Ghosh. Deputy Chair, Ms. Price.
Thank you, Chair. And I think it's good evening to everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. Conscious of the time, so I will ask a couple of questions and perhaps we'll try and keep our comments as brief as possible. One thing I'm particularly interested in is the sort of the structure that's being created when we talk about the First Nations Financial Board. Mr. Keller,
yes.
Could you explain, is it a board that's been set up and reports to, I take it Indigenous Services is like the Indigenous government department? Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
So who does that board report to? To the Minister of Indigenous Services?
It's the Fiscal Management Act institutions are shared governance model institutions, except the Finance Authority is an independent private sector, but the Tax Commission, the Financial Management Board are shared governance model institutions. We're funded by the federal government pursuant to a corporate plan that gets approved by the ministers each year. And the Aboriginal Financial Officers Association of Canada appoints 3 directors. The Government of Canada, through Governor of Council, appoints up to 10 others, including the chair. And we operate pursuant to an independent board who are appointed. We're not told what to do by government. We understand what our legislative purposes are and what our legislative mandate is. And through our interpretation and our capacity to get advice where we need to, we operate within that framework. We engage First Nation communities in the development of laws, measures of financial performance and financial management systems to ensure that there is accountability and transparency in the several $billion that are delivered by Canada into First Nation communities on an annual basis. We have qualifications that we look for in those who come forward, and we participate, I as the chair participate significantly in the selection process of directors that apply to become a member of the board of directors. We are predominantly Indigenous, and it's not legislated that way, but it was a commitment given to us by government that they have fulfilled to this day.
Okay, thank you. That's cleared it up for me. That's a very good succinct answer. Just as a bit of context, I'm a member for Durack, which is the largest electorate in Australia, predominantly northwest in Australia, but my electorate starts 1 hour from metropolitan Perth. The size of it is about 1.6 million square kilometres. Now that pales into insignificance compared to Nunavut. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Yes, you are.
The home of the Inuit people. Nunavut is 2 million square kilometres, but I don't believe you have as many people living in that electorate as I have in Durack. But nonetheless, I don't have a lot of people living in my electorate because of the size of it. But in the northwest, predominantly in the Kimberley and also in the Pilbara, where the large part of my Indigenous constituents live, and both you and Keith have touched on this a little. We have many West Australian Aboriginal people who live in incredibly poor housing. Education is poor. Drug and alcohol issues are rampant. The drug issue is increasing daily as we try to get control of alcohol. And one of you have mentioned that we can't expect all Indigenous communities to progress at the same time, and I agree with that, and I think it's a really good lesson for us all to learn, because if you've got Indigenous people living in metropolitan Perth or in Victoria, or in Melbourne or Sydney, especially in those major cities where the education levels of Indigenous Australians is high, then it's understandable that the opportunities, whether it's a small business or young people going to university, that's more possible. But the reality is, for the people that I represent, especially in the northwest, having sort of financial independence, economic self-determination is a long way off. And so we celebrate the small victories, and they are small, but we celebrate the small victories all the time. So what I'm interested in is really, I just want to share with you, we sort of feel your pain, but also, we're also celebrating our victories as well. So how are you dealing with, when you're talking about, whether it's the entrepreneurial program, I see you run one with women, and well done, that's fantastic, but whether it's the loan programs or the access to capital, how are you dealing with the skills side of what's required to run a business? And I guess from a corporate governance perspective, do you have particular programs that are sort of, in a sense, sort of attached to some of your lending requirements?
Yes, we have. And it starts with some of our universities. Simon Fraser University in British Columbia and University of British Columbia offer Indigenous MBA programs, as an example, where they give support and preference to those kinds of individuals. I think, I'm actually going to Edmonton next week to talk to some urban Indians about the reality of the migration of our Indigenous population to urban centers where there is opportunity. And I think that's a reality that we all have to face. This notion that our rights and title are centered in a geographic location within a federation in Canada is just not valid any longer. The reality is we need portability of rights. We need to be in a position where we are supported to move to where the opportunities exist initially, and perhaps go back, as I did in 1987. What I didn't say in the beginning is I worked as an accountant in many years in international business for a company in British Columbia that supplied Speedo with all of its swim accessory products. And that was a very successful relationship for many, many years until Speedo, which was a private company, sold. But I had that opportunity to move around within a city environment to do that. We need to provide opportunities for rural citizens to come to urban centers in a culturally protected way that supports the life skills training that they need to undertake in the very beginning. One of the first projects I did for the Squamish Nation was negotiate the building of a major grocery store on our lands. We started, and we included employment provisions and lease, but we started with life skills training. And you have to start back at that level when you're in very remote, difficult communities where they haven't had a lot of exposure or experience. But too often the Indigenous community, even today, coming to Vancouver, is a culture shock for people from the north. So we need to provide a safe haven for them to come and to support them and encourage them as they progress through the system of getting an education. The other thing that I think is really important is this inclusion within the private sector of Indigenous people. That will shorten the time frame that is required for many of our Indigenous people to raise their exposure and experience to a level where they can meaningfully contribute back home.
Okay, thank you. That's very good. I appreciate that. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Perrott.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening. Apologies for being a little bit late at the start. I'm going to ask a sort of a wide-ranging question, so happy to get a wide-ranging answer. In Australia, we have two types of land tenure. The Crown system, which allows for individual ownership and collective, and then native title law, which allows for collective ownership, which creates some opportunities and some challenges. Combining with that fact that you just touched on, Mr. Keller, the idea of First Nations people being removed from where they have collective ownership to urban environments. I think roughly approximately 50% of First Nations people are in urban environments in Australia. How has Canada grappled with that? With one suggestion being that private ownership of land, if land gives economic power, which is you touched on as being a transition in Canada, if land gives economic power, how have Canadians grappled with that in terms of giving ongoing benefits to people that maybe are removed from their country of origin or their land of origin? I think you talked, if you haven't been to Edmonton yet, but what are the opportunities to give economic benefits to people who are disconnected from their land? And this is the wide-ranging part. I think we've talked about renewable energy projects, mining and resource projects, timber harvesting. So many economic benefits, fishing rights. I think even we talked about $100 million in rates coming from ownership of people residing on a First Nations land. Is that evenly spread around Canada? Is it the same in First Nations, Inuit and Métis communities? What are the some of the lessons to be learned and opportunities? And I apologise for that being wide-ranging. I'll throw it to you.
Well, I'll start, and then I'm going to invite Keith.
Yeah.
I think, the Squamish Nation, we call it the Squamish Nation, and it was a nation before the reserve allocation process in the 1800s. But they divided our nation up into 17 different Indian bands. And then they started to come after the land they'd allocated to us. And so the community came together after a 4-year negotiation to amalgamate and become the Squamish Nation again with individual rights as a nation. We made the decision as a people to hold the land collectively, okay? Which doesn't mean that we don't have access to some of that land. But our government holds that land, okay? And I think therein lies a distinction. Urban lands, we need to be in a position where there is a recognition somewhere that there is a governance model that's tied to First Nations that supports that. Now, what we're developing in Canada in the last little while are joint reserve lands that are granted to more than one rights holder for joint management and stewardship. And I think that's the kind of thing that I think is going to help in that exercise. I think the big challenge that we still face is that if I leave the reserve, I am not I do not carry the same opportunities with me where if I go to non-Indigenous lands. And I see that as a problem that I think if there was portability in that, it would greatly change.
Sorry, could I just tease that out? Does that mean the idea that you could still get that tree harvesting benefit even when you're living in New York? You know, you might still get an economic benefit from the land you are connected to.
That's utopia that I hope we get to.
Okay. And sorry, and just rewinding slightly, when you said that the nation, does that mean I could build a house, have a fence around it, and then give that house to my children, who can then give it to their children?
Yeah.
So I've got a right to reside on that block of dirt and get the economic benefits, so that my children don't have to build their house. You know,
That's correct, but you can only give it to an Indigenous person, and generally within we call them bands. So in my community, we can pass our houses down as if it were fee simple down, but we can only pass it down to another member of our band.
So I can't sell it to a wealthy Chinese millionaire. I can only.
No.
So the market price is determined by the community.
Now, what we do is we lease some of our urban land to some of those rich Asians.
Sorry, just plucking that from the air, but
yeah. Well, no, it's true. The fact of the matter is,
it's a market, an indication of price, of value. So,
well, then we need the investment required, the capacity to do some of the development that we're doing. I mean, my community is doing a $4 billion housing project in downtown Vancouver. There's no way in the world we could do that by ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah.
And sorry, if you wanted to respond to the idea how patchy is the economic growth.
I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah.
So it's varied, right? It's like place-based opportunities and economic success. I mean, Squamish is one classic example of location. West Bank is another neighboring community with economic opportunities. Beautiful backdrop of mountains. Beautiful place to retire. So great place to set up a Home Depot. All this stuff. And then down east, it's access to transportation corridors, bringing great economic success in some of the Atlantic provinces. So it's dispersed, but yet we do have successes. We do have what I call pockets of heaven in remote flying communities where companies have actively, respectfully pursued strong partnership agreements with the Indigenous communities and having the First Nations being equity partners. It's no longer a tick box and, oh, yes, we consulted them. No, they're wanting to be at the economic decision-making table as equity partners. And we're seeing an emergence of that across the nation here and there. So it's a good story. It's a good movement. But yeah, even with the challenges of remote flying communities, we've seen some successes there as well in the resource sector, renewable energy, mining. It's not all a rosy park for sure. If they don't do the consultation engagement right, it's going to be a mess. And just like we have in Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, it's been a disaster from day one. No consensus, too slow on the pace. The market's gone. Now we've got another opportunity on our doorstep on critical minerals across this country. And where are the critical minerals? All on traditional territories. So it'll be an imperative to develop those meaningful partnership arrangements, equity agreements that could really, really bring a lot of benefits to the community, but also to the regional economy, the non-Indigenous neighbors, depending on where that is.
Do the critical minerals belong to the Crown or do they belong to the land owner?
It's a mix.
They belong to the Crown.
Okay.
And
the right to harvest them can benefit the community.
Well, the other challenge we have is that Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution of Canada separated the powers between the provinces and the federal government. And natural resources were given to the provinces.
Yeah. Same, mostly here. Yeah.
Now they're finding they can't develop So the provinces are now coming to the table because, notwithstanding the fact of this relationship in 91 to 92 of the Constitution, they're not able to pursue economic development without Indigenous input.
That's right.
Thank you. Chair, did we cover off all those questions? So I just don't have that particular interest in the is there any understanding of any nations that have grappled with that? Perhaps say in around Montreal or the big global cities where First Nations have perhaps been more displaced of how they have addressed economic opportunities and collective ownership and that interplay between a colonial settlement that's 400 or 500 years old.
Well, I can think of the acquisition of land through treaty land entitlement issues that are happening, and communities are looking to urban centers to establish urban reserves. That's something that's happening now. There needs to be a bit of, I guess, an explanation about the role of the government in owning the land, not unlike the role of other governments in owning the land and the ability to use the land and your right to use the land. And I think those models are being developed in Indigenous communities today. So we have, the history of Canada saw a loss of Indigenous allocated land throughout the history. So there's a big fear in it. So we want to protect that, and we're doing that now by establishing long-term leases that provide the kind of security that's needed to attract investment and participation on those lands. So, for example, in downtown Vancouver, we have a 120-year lease on that particular piece of property to build these housing. And we're talking about mechanisms where individuals within that could buy term as they wanted to sell. So you could be there for 50 years on a predetermined basis, buy another 50 years, and put 100 years back on the market.
And my final question, Chair, is in terms of the energy mining projects, renewable energy, etc. Are there any mandated requirements for Indigenous employment throughout and training and the like on such projects?
Yeah, so I'll take a stab. So, a number of projects, if they're thinking well and through it, will have some set aside for Indigenous employment and training. That's a negotiation between the nation and the project proponent. We see many examples of that in mining and renewable energy. So it's again, and there's also impact benefit agreements, which secures some capacity dollars in some instances for training and capacity development in trades, for example, or metal management. So it varies from project to project.
Okay.
But there's some very good promising practices out there.
Yeah, I mentioned before, I serve on the board of the Trans Mountain group of companies that brought oil to tidal water. That was a $30 billion project. $6 billion of that was Indigenous procurement. 11% of the workforce was Indigenous. We got skills trades out of it. There was impact benefit agreements of between, I think, 700 and 800 million. And now we're talking about a 20%, up to a 20% equity participation in the ownership of the pipeline. So, as I always like to say, when people talk about economic reconciliation, they need to look at what Trans Mountain did as a platform from which to consider how economic reconciliation might work. And included in that is the very substantial impediment that we face today, and that is access to capital. And some of the things that we're currently working on is investigating the merit of developing an Indigenous development bank.
It might be slightly outside your remit, but are your superannuation funds investing in such projects?
Not yet, but they better be starting. One of the outcomes that is occurring in this country and will occur into the future is settlement of past wrong claims. And on the books of Canada, they've already paid out $40 billion. There's another $80 billion on the books, I believe. There's going to be a lot of money transferred to First Nation communities. And part of the challenge that we face at the moment is trying to bring all of those funds under a common tent and looking at how we can make substantial investments with that kind of critical mass to look at kind of more significant returns for major projects, and then look at some impact investing as a component of that.
So the housing project you talked about, that would give us a long-term sustainable return to a First Nations group, would be my understanding.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Perrott. And Mr. Keller, can I ask that you talked about the kind of the oil pipeline project being a good case study for economic reconciliation. Do you have anything that you can provide the committee that kind of sets out all the different things that happen there to kind of go to your point about it being a good case study?
I would suggest you go on the Trans Mountain website and download the ESG report that we prepared.
Okay.
And if you can't find it there, you've got my contact information. There's a lot of information, but the ESG report is a public report, and it identifies the kind of economic participation that was there in that. So I think it, the other thing that you should mention here on these kinds of projects, you need the union movement to get on board.
Yeah. And what role did the union movement play?
Well, allowing entry into the union, providing a space for people to be trained to, at the end goal, get red ticket tradesmen out of the system. Well, in our case, it was welders, heavy machine operators, engineers, accountants. We got everybody there.
Yeah.
As part of that project. But that was the commitment they made, because it was a linear pipeline, obviously. 122 communities were impacted, and I think they got 78 communities to sign on to the project as a result of that.
Yeah. And are you taking some of the lessons learnt from that project into the $4 billion housing project that we've talked about this evening for you?
Yeah, well, the $4 billion housing project is a joint venture with a prominent builder in downtown Vancouver. Yeah. There's some social housing impacted on it. This was one of the original reserves that it was being built on, that we are building on, that was taken from us in the 1930s. We've created a joint venture with a corporation that's going to reestablish that community with member housing. It will become the second largest populated reserve in the Squamish Nation. We don't have a single contiguous reserve. We have 16 different reserves. And this land will allow us to reestablish our community in the downtown core. Kitsilano was right in the heart of downtown Vancouver. And we will need to put administration buildings, schools, all of that back into that setting. It's an aspiration and a dream that our elders had when they brought everybody back together in 1923, of which my grandfather, by the way, was part of.
And so as a part of that, the project, so it sounds like the kind of purpose is to bring people back together for mobs to be able to make money. Sorry, that's a term that we use here, mobs. Yes. First Nations communities to be able to make money. And the other thing that I'm interested in, you kind of talked about the skills and jobs as a part of the kind of pipeline project. Will that be similar here? Like, will there be a really deliberate kind of upskilling of people and community members? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The majority of the workforce in the company that's building this has majority Indigenous participation, but not just our Squamish members, from all over Canada.
Okay. And on a different topic now. You mentioned in your memorandum submission to the inquiry, you talked about the First Nations, the Fiscal Management Act being possible because of it enjoyed bipartisan support.
Yes.
Yeah. What I suppose I'm keen, the First Nation space in Australia can be contested at the best of times. I'm keen to understand, I suppose, kind of what it was, like what data and information, or kind of what was the kind of compelling argument that meant that you were able to enjoy that bipartisan support. Like in thinking about kind of what we might need to get agreement across the parliament, be able to pursue something like this. What did you see as being really key to being able to get that bipartisan support?
Government's inability to move beyond a place where it is required to fund the poverty that exists. Okay, I mean, the social dysfunction, the challenges, the migration to urban centers, were all factors in saying we got to do something. And so our view was, do you want to invest in growing the gross domestic product, or are you prepared to continue to fund the cost of poverty? And that's in a populating base that's growing. I think the other thing that happened is we have, in some areas of the country, have significant urban reserve and very strategically placed lands, and they were needed. They were needed by the growth of the cities. And I think that those kinds of factors really contributed to an interest on the part of Canada at the time, together with the emerging litany of Supreme Court of Canada decisions that continue to reaffirm Indigenous rights, the duty to consult and accommodate. All of those things contributed to saying, do we really want to spend and continue billions and billions of dollars on government programs and services? Or do we want to be in a position where we're creating an investment opportunity and economic growth that the non-Indigenous public can also participate in? That was a very powerful argument in particularly the Conservative Party in Canada and getting them on board. And many people didn't think it was possible, but we did. And in fact, through the work of both federal departments, a year ago this past June, we got the amendments to the Fiscal Management Act through from introduction to the end in 78 days because we had all party support.
Okay.
It was taking, on average, the Liberal government 270-something days to get a bill through the House and to get royal assent. Because everybody sees an interest. You know, if we go there as Indigenous people and say we want, and just benefit us, it doesn't fall politically on ears that people want to listen to. If they can see where they can benefit from the kind of things that we're proposing, I think that's very critical, because the non-Indigenous public has many of the same challenges we do. We need jobs, we need a house, we need all of those things. And we're only going to get those things if we grow our economy. And we've proven that it's much easier to grow the economy when you include the Indigenous people than you don't.
And so do you have the data that talks to the kind of benefit to the non-Indigenous community?
No, we don't. I wish Keith was involved very early on in a First Nations statistical institute that we wanted to build. And that is exactly the kind of information that we were trying to get to. We have some authorities now to start gathering some of that, but I can only tell you what happens in my community.
Yeah, okay.
We live in an urban center, and we probably represent $3 to $4 billion a year to the Vancouver economy right now, using a multiplier effect of 4. We refer to something we call bungee economics. The money comes in and it leaves. It's now starting to stay encircled.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen some data here, or had some evidence to the committee that talks about, when you, for non-Indigenous people, when they kind of receive $1, how long it stays in the economy versus how long when First Nations people receive $1, how long that stays in the economy for. And there is a difference of, I think, a week and a half or 2 weeks, which is super interesting. Sorry, Mr. Con, were you going to say something?
Oh, yes, thank you. I just, we can do a lot more data gathering, but it's really the initiative of, for example, I'll give you a case in point, the Atlantic First Nations on the Atlantic coast in Canada deliberately engaged some expertise to quantify the contributions by First Nations economic activities in the Atlantic region to the GDP of the Atlantic region. So it's pretty impressive, pretty persuasive, and to be made available to the public, the private sector, and it was quite eye-opening and very welcomed. And so that just opens more doors about, partnerships, equity participation. So that's one beautiful example. I think we can do more of that. So that's something we need to explore together.
Yeah. I feel like data has been a really strong theme through inquiry.
Yes.
Not, in kind of lots of ways, not quite capturing the right information, or there's not even kind of attempt to capture the information. And I think in Australia we're a bit behind in even thinking about what in a kind of larger scale about what Aboriginal people contribute to our economy here, in that kind of more mature way that we've heard from you today. And it's like, as Mr. Keller said, it is kind of lots, like there's lots of kind of stuck in the kind of the deficit kind of welfare kind of mentality rather than thinking about that kind of wealth creation. So I think there is a kind of a shift that needs to happen there in Australia, because I think, to your point in terms of the imperative, like we've got the Future Made in Australia here, like we've got an initiative called Future Made in Australia, we've got the renewable energies, the green future. Lots of the work that needs to happen in these spaces are going to happen on Aboriginal land. And so to your point about kind of there's a can't quite think of the right word now, but there's a need for government to get into this kind of conversation if they want to be able to unlock the kind of economic opportunity there.
One of the things we don't measure is opportunity cost. We don't measure opportunity cost. And when I look at British Columbia as an example, the Premier of this province campaigned on a $40 billion LNG business that just evaporated. So when we look at Indigenous economic development, it's not just all of that is Indigenous. It's what economic development occurs because we support it and can attract the investment, both of the private sector and the financial community. And that data, I'd love to be able to start to assess. I mean, that's a research project for somebody.
There's lots of really great things to want to delve into more if we've got the right data. Now I'm quickly running out of time. I've got a quick question about intellectual property laws that you might or might not have. It's come up a fair bit through the inquiry as being a barrier for First Nations people participating in the, especially in the kind of business world, where they're worried about, I suppose, a lack of protection for intellectual and cultural property here. Do you have protections for First Nations people in intellectual property?
Keith, I don't think we do, but I could stand corrected.
I have to follow through on that. I'm not an expert in that field, but there's certainly intellectual property clauses in certain agreements, but I don't think we have a law that's specifically protecting the Indigenous interests.
Yeah.
It has come up time and time again, right? At the international level, UN level. I could ask my team to do some research on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if you could provide that on notice, that would be great, because it's certainly something that the committee is looking at. How do we protect Indigenous cultural knowledge in especially products, where it might be kind of agricultural products or whatever it is, and you want to take that to the international market. Then the next question that I've got is specifically about First Nations women. And is there, we certainly know here that there are, additional economic barriers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And so I'm keen to kind of understand, you've probably identified the same things, I imagine, and what it is you might be doing in response to those additional barriers.
I can take a stab. So yes. I mean, we have a high incarceration rate of Indigenous women in this country. It's just not really acceptable. Violence, lateral violence, domestic violence, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Lots of recommendations for action, as you may know. We do have support and funding support for an Indigenous Women's Advisory Council here in Canada. So that's a number of representatives from the private sector, academic sector, and women's organizations. So that's a venue for discussing some of the challenges and opportunities and priorities. And that's led by my former Associate Deputy Minister, Valerie Gideon. And so we could probably get an update on what their work entails, their scope, their mandate. That might be helpful. As another, info on notice. Yes, I love that expression.
Yep, additional information on notice. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And then the other question I've got, I think it was you, Mr. Culler, that talked about cultural safety. You called it kind of culturally protected, which I thought was interesting when you talked about people travelling into cities to undertake work or training. But on something we've talked about a little bit about today already, which is how have you incorporated those kind of cultural safety or cultural protections into the economic reconciliation policies, and why has that been important? Kind of where's that kind of drive come from?
Well, I know that in the projects that my community is involved in, we actually have counselors on site to deal with people. Okay, that's the first thing. You've got to invest in them. We are very closely looking at housing and having a group gathered of Indigenous people living in close proximity to one another. Those are the things that I think are really critical. Having more than one individual participate in a skills development program is also very critical, so that you're not feeling isolated, and I think being included in the surrounding communities' cultural and social activities is also very, very important, and it needs to be encouraged. And the celebrations that we have, the teachings that we have, I think are really, really important for us to do, and to look at ensuring that our urban organizations are supported in a way that allow them to respond to the needs of individuals who come to urban centers to be able to support. That's really what I'm going to Edmonton to talk about. What do urban organizations need to do to be able to support that migration in a way that sees those people have a more than a 50-50 chance of success by supporting them?
Thank you. And I, with my remaining 2 minutes with you, can I ask, because I know it's not necessarily finished yet, but your economic reconciliation framework, what are the types of things that are in there, and what do you expect the outcomes of that to be?
Go. The world is your oyster. So that's in play. The minister is advancing work to seek cabinet authority and support for the economic reconciliation framework, working with folks like Harold and other institutions and other partners, First Nation with Métis. And there's about 26 proposals in play from our partners. We're trying to ascertain which are some of the more tangible ones we can work on in the immediate future, near and immediate future. as well as, keep those other proposals in play through our annual policy cycle under the framework. Access to capital, business supports for communities, capacity building. Those are a couple examples. There's work from the Inuit from the north looking at economic opportunities to support traditional country food gathering exercises to support communities and assist for food security. There's a number in play, but we can provide, again, another short brief on info on note. But it's really lots of it at foot, lots of the conversations as we speak on the prioritization of priorities, largely building on our National Indigenous Economic Development Strategy developed 2 years ago, and then Harold's lead on the roadmap exercise. So it's all tied in. It's a little complicated, but we're navigating.
You take it on the challenge. That's a good thing.
Yes, absolutely.
That is a good thing. And on notice, just because we are out of time, I would really appreciate kind of seeing what it is you do to support kind of First Nations businesses from the startup phase all the way through to kind of the scaling up into kind of an international trade phase, if you've got that information. And if you can, like how much those programs receive in funding. You might not be able to repeat it, but...
Well, we have something called the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations that provide Indigenous businesses with loan opportunities. It's been very successful, but it needs to scale up as the economic activity has increased in terms of dollar volume. We need things like an Indigenous Development Bank to be able to support the scale up required to participate. We're hopeful that a procurement initiative with the federal government will provide a stream of business that we need to focus on how we would organize the Indigenous community, and not necessarily rights holders or communities, but everybody to be able to respond to. I think there's some work that needs to be done in that area that we're starting to work on through the work that Keith and his team are doing with the existing Indigenous institutions that we have in this country. Through the initiative of ISK, we're getting together and starting to not fight with one another over resources and opportunities, but collaborate with one another. An unusual concept.
Foreign can be foreign here too, don't worry. Anyway, that's unfortunately all we have time for today. But I do want to give my sincere thanks for your attendance here today. For the request for additional information, the due date for that is the 18th of October. If you could please provide that to the Secretariat. You will also be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request any corrections to transcription errors. And thank you very much today on behalf of the committee. I would like to thank Hansard and the Secretariat for their support today, and I declare the hearing today closed.